Bobby Fischer was one of the most powerful chess entities to ever walk the face of the earth, capable of punishing even the most imperceptible of inaccuracies with terrifying precision. In most of the games of his that I review on this channel, he's up against world-class opponents who know how to handle themselves in the opening and are therefore able to usually survive well into the middle game before eventually succumbing to Fischer's relentless pressure. But now and then, even these elite grandmasters will slip up in the opening, giving Fischer the opportunity to ferociously rip them to shreds before the game even has a chance to get started. And these are the spectacular opening disasters that we are going to be looking at today. I have for you 3 instances where Bobby Fischer absolutely destroyed world-class grandmasters with vicious opening traps, each of which effectively ended the game before move 12. 2 of these are going to be blitz games, which many of you may not have seen, and the third is a classical game that is much more well known. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. Game number 1 is from the year 1963, the place is the Manhattan Chess Club in New York, the time control is blitz, and Bobby Fischer, playing white, opens the game with e4. His opponent, the elite grandmaster Reuben Fine, which Chessmetrics gives a performance rating as high as number 1 in the world at different periods during the early 1940s, and a former US speed chess champion, responds e5. We have knight to f3 from Fischer, d6 from Fine. This is known as the Philidor defense. It's not very popular at the highest level, or at any level, being a bit passive and overly defensive, supporting e5, but giving up on ever playing d5 in one move. It also blocks the dark squared bishop right away, not ideal. And after Fischer plays what is usually considered white's strongest response, d4, attacking e5 twice, best for black is probably e takes d4, just giving up his central e-pawn right away, despite having made a rather passive move to support it. Then he can play knight to f6, and white has a bit of an advantage. But Reuben Fine goes for knight to d7, which in a way is very principled. Despite being inferior to e takes d4, at least he's being consistent, going all in to support his pride and joy on e5, a pawn that he's not going to let go of so easily. Knight to d7 is of course superior to knight to c6, which would get kicked around with the move d5, but he is blocking in his light squared bishop, and it makes no progress towards castling. Bobby Fischer plays bishop to c4, as he's done in many a game. He really seems to love putting his light squared bishop on this diagonal, and black already needs to be very careful. If you just play some natural developing move, like the one played by 21% of all online players to reach this position, bishop to e7, here black is already lost after d takes e5. Now if d takes e5, then there's queen to d5, and how are you stopping that queen from getting into f7? You're not. Knight to h6 will just be captured, and black is finished. You can try knight takes e5 instead, but after knight takes e5 and d takes e5, there's queen to h5, again hitting that f-pawn, threatening to capture on e5 as well. No good way to prevent both, and black is losing here as well. So this is a good line to remember, since there are a significant number of Philidor players who will walk into this with black. Reuben Fine was hip to this though, which is why in this position, he continues with the move c6. Now if white captures on e5 at some point, black can respond d takes e5, and there won't be any queen to d5. So Bobby Fischer just castles, and now we have bishop to e7. And in case anyone is wondering why bishop to e7 is played before knight to f6, well, it's so after d takes e5, played now by Fischer, Fine can respond d takes e5 when the g5 square is well covered, so there's no knight to g5 attacking f7. Or is there? The engine actually gives knight to g5 as white's best move anyway. Now this wasn't played in the game, but the point is that after bishop takes g5, you got queen to h5, threatening both queen takes f7 mate and queen takes g5, regaining the piece. No good way for black to defend both, so the engine's giving queen to e7, queen takes g5, queen takes g5, and bishop takes g5, with a significant advantage to white. He's got his lead in development, this active bishop pair, while black's development will be a bit awkward, particularly with his light squared bishop, who's going to be lacking active squares. So were Bobby Fischer and Reuben Fine even aware of this variation? I tend to think that they must have been, but for whatever reason, Fischer didn't go for this, maybe not eager for a queen trade so early in the game. So after d takes e5, he instead goes for queen to e2, a move which is very dangerous in its own right, and evidence that he is already formulating the winning combination. And things are now getting very tricky for black, whose best move is actually h6, so that knight to f6 can be played next with no knight to g5 from white. But Reuben Fine thinks that he can play knight to f6 right away. Why not? If knight to g5, black can just castle. f7 is defended twice, and everything is just fine for fine, right? Well, that's true, but Fischer now has a much stronger move than the immediate knight to g5, and that is rook to d1. But wait a minute, you might be saying. If knight to g5 wasn't the best move, then why was h6 necessary from black? Well, it's because knight to g5 is still on the cards, as we're going to see. Now, black can't immediately castle here, unless he wants to lose his e5 pawn to knight takes e5, since his defending knight on d7 is now pinned to his queen, as a result of this move rook to d1. So what to do as black? The best defense, which is far from obvious, is b5, driving the c4 bishop back to b3, and only then playing queen to c7 to break that pin on the knight, ready to castle next. White should then continue a4, attacking the pawn on b5, which black really needs to maintain. He can't push it to b4, for example, or he'll lose very quickly, and you're going to see why shortly. And this is actually a big clue as to what Fischer's winning combination is going to be. So black would need to defend b5 with something like rook to b8. White can exchange pawns, and then play knight to c3, adding an attacker to b5 with a healthy edge, but black is still in the game. But now let's look at what Reuben Fine played. After Fischer's rook to d1, he thought he could go straight for queen to c7, breaking the pin on his knight, but leaving the c4 square available to white, giving Fischer his winning tactical shot. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot the move Fischer played next, but here it comes. Fischer's move is knight to g5. Now, if you said bishop takes f7 check, give yourself full points for that as well. The point is, after king takes f7, we have queen to c4 check, and that's why black's move b5 was essential to prevent this follow-up. So after king to e8 and knight to g5, threatening mate in 2, beginning with queen to f7 check, followed by knight to e6, rook f8 is there to defend, but then there's knight to e6, hitting the queen, with knight takes g7 check coming next, and black's position is totally collapsing. But the move Fischer played in the game, knight to g5, is equally winning and a bit more straightforward. f7 is of course attacked twice, so Reuben Fine responds by castling, apparently unaware that this does not adequately defend his f-pawn, which Fischer now captures with bishop takes f7 check, a move which prompts immediate resignation from Reuben Fine. Black has but two legal moves here. He can move his king to h8 and allow knight to e6, forking his queen and rook, or he can recapture with rook takes f7, and after queen to c4, that rook is going away. It's pinned to the king, attacked twice, and will be lost. Now, if black hadn't played queen to c7, then queen to f8 would be there to defend, which is why Fischer threw in this move rook to d1 before capturing on f7, thereby luring the black queen off of d8, where she could no longer play to f8 and defend. So, fabulous and virtually flawless play from Fischer, destroying a former Blitz champion in a Blitz game in only 10 moves. Absolutely stunning. So, moving on to our next game, it's another Blitz encounter, this one played in 1966 in Santa Monica, California, against another chess legend, the Danish Grandmaster Bent Larsen, widely considered to be the strongest non-Soviet player besides Bobby Fischer for much of the 1960s and 70s. Fischer again has the white pieces and opens with e4. Of course, proven in practice to be best by test, to which Bent Larsen responds knight to f6, Alekhine's defense. A fearless decision, inviting e5 from Fischer, known to be the strongest response, kicking the knight off of the f6 square right away. It goes to d5, where it can be further kicked around with the move c4, when white would grab more central control with tempo, but there's also the equally strong d4, played now by Fischer, which is a bit more flexible, keeping the option of c4 on the table, while not ruling out the possibility of bishop to c4. So play continues d6, the main line, striking at white's e-pawn right away, while activating the light-squared bishop. We have knight to f3, supporting e5 with development, The Engine prefers c4, followed by f4 instead, focusing on gaining maximum space and support for the big pawn center, but this is blitz, and Fischer prefers piece activity. And with the way this game turned out, you really can't criticize his decision. We have d takes e5, knight takes e5, and now knight to d7 from Larsen, which incredibly is already a mistake. Looks totally natural, challenging the knight on e5, and Larsen had actually played this move before, most notably a year earlier in 1965 when he used it to secure a draw against the great sacrificing genius Mikhail Tal, who in this position failed to play the strongest move, which Fischer now executes. Take a moment and try to determine what White's best move is in this position. And the move is knight takes f7. And it's remarkable that Tal, known to be one of the most liberal sacrificers of all time, rejected this move, which must have been a real confidence booster for Larsen that this line must be okay. But now he finds himself facing the sacrifice from the great Fischer. So how is he going to proceed? Well, the first move is pretty easy. The king really has to recapture, otherwise the black queen is lost. Since she has no squares, she can't move. So after king takes f7, we have queen to h5 check from Fischer, attacking the knight on d5, to which the only reasonable response is king to e6, getting out of check while defending. Next comes queen to g4 check, which doesn't really make any progress unless White wants the game to end in a threefold repetition, which wouldn't be wise since White has the much better position, possibly even winning at this point. But Larsen puts his king back to f7, ready to meet queen to f5 check with knight d to f6. This would give black the winning position, so Fischer has no choice but to repeat with queen to h5 check, king goes back to e6, and now the only way for White to play for a win is with the move c4. Not played by Fischer, but the point is that after this attacked knight moves, let's say to f6 for example, White has d5 check, driving the king to d6, away from the relative safety of the f7 square, and after queen to f7, threatening mate in 5, beginning with queen to e6 check, black doesn't really have a great way to save his king without giving the piece back. For example, if black tries knight to c5, guarding e6, then there's just b4, attacking the knight, and if it moves, then c5 check will result in black's rapid demise. Another try is knight to e5, which looks pretty good, attacking the queen. e6 is covered by the bishop, but here we just have bishop to f4, pinning the knight, threatening to get the piece back immediately with c5 check, followed by bishop taking on e5, though the Engine gives knight to c3 as an even bigger threat, looking for knight to b5 check, and it's evaluating this position as being almost a pawn and a half in White's favor. So White is probably winning by force here, but Fischer didn't go for this line. Perhaps he calculated this and just thought the position looked a bit too murky for a blitz game. And so, after king to e6, he repeated the position with queen to g4 check, giving Larsen the draw by repetition. If he puts his king back to f7, then Fischer's only move that doesn't lose would be to check the king with queen to h5 for the third time, giving Larsen the draw. But incredibly, Larsen rejects king to f7 and instead goes for king to d6, a losing blunder. He's basically saying, I don't believe you, I think your sacrifice is flawed, and I'm going to play for the win. But this is a very bad idea, which Fischer now demonstrates with engine-like precision beginning with c4, attacking the knight. Now if black were to move the attacked knight to f6, then c5 check would be a big problem, forcing black to sack a piece with knight takes c5, since the only alternative is to get mated in 2 moves at most, with king to d5, knight to c3 check, king to c6, and queen to e6 checkmate. Which is why, in this position, after the move c4, Larsen moves his other knight to f6 instead, which is the better way to attack the white queen, since it activates the light-squared bishop, who is now guarding e6, so that after c5 check from white, the king can safely go to c6, and there's no queen to e6 with a forced mate. But Fischer has another devastating check at his disposal here, with queen to g3 check, which will win back the sacrificed piece, so the best black can hope for now is a draw, but against the mighty Fischer, this is but a desperate pipe dream. Larsen responds king to e6. There's really nothing better since everything loses. Fischer takes on d5 with check, at which point running to f7 with the king might be the most prudent thing to do, although white could then maintain his crushing position with the move bishop to c4. But Larsson decides he's going to at least equalize the material for the moment with queen takes d5, but allowing Fischer to get more pieces developed with tempo is not the wisest thing you could do here as black. We have knight to c3, hitting the queen. Larsson grabs another pawn on d4. Why not? He is up in material now, but after bishop to e3, Team Black has some real problems. Not that he didn't have problems before, but the queen is attacked yet again, and she doesn't have a lot of good squares, as in she has 0 good squares. If white is allowed to play bishop to c4 with check, that is going to be very, very bad. Driving the king to the d-file when rook to d1 check will put the final nail in black's coffin, and it will be pretty much all over except for the crying and the burying. Note that king to f5 would run into checkmate in 1 with queen to g5. So Larsson plays queen to b4 here, keeping that watchful eye on the c4 square, but here comes a3. And how are you going to watch over c4 now? Black could try queen to g4, but then queen takes c7 would just threaten bishop to c4 check again, which black would not really be able to prevent. But in the game, we have queen takes b2. It's worth a shot. He is threatening to take on a1 or c3 with check. But Fischer, of course, strikes first with his bishop to c4 check. The king goes to d7, and here comes rook to d1 check. To which black has only one reasonable response, king to e8. Since king to c6 would give white a mate in 2, beginning with queen to f3 check. And here white has many winning moves, but Fischer finds the most crushing one, and that is knight to b5. A move so devastating that it causes Bent Larsson to immediately resign the game. The most horrific threat here is, of course, knight takes c7 checkmate. Now black can't really prevent the knight from getting to c7, so the best he can do is to play something like e6, blocking the c4 bishop's access to f7, so that after knight takes c7 check, at least his king has a square with king to f7. But here, the simplest win for white is... what do you think it is? Would you play knight takes a8? If you would, that would be a mistake, since it would allow queen to c3 with check, picking up the bishop on c4, and that actually equalizes the position. So what white should do first is throw in the move bishop to d4, hitting the black queen and guarding that c3 square, so that after, let's say, queen takes a3, white is all good to grab the rook on a8. So a very pleasing slaying of the great Bent Larsson, who on move 10 threw away his opportunity to draw in favor of moving his king towards the center of the board. Not something you should expect to get away with when you're up against the great Bobby Fischer. But moving on to our final game, it is a pretty famous one, played in the 1958 US Championship, which Bobby Fischer went on to win. His opponent is the former child prodigy and 7-time US champion Samuel Reshevsky, who only 5 years earlier was a serious contender for the World Championship, placing a joint 2nd in the candidates tournament. So on paper, Bobby Fischer should be in for a long, challenging struggle, but that is not what happens. Fischer, again playing white, opens with e4, and this time we get a Sicilian defense, with some very mainline moves. The thematic d4, of course, the pawns are exchanged, and from Reshevsky we have g6. This is known as the accelerated dragon variation, which differs from the normal Sicilian dragon in that black fianchettos his bishop early, before playing the move d6. He's going to wait on moving this d-pawn so he can preserve the possibility of pushing it to d5 in one move. Fischer plays knight to c3, and we have all the normal moves. Nothing unusual here. Knight to f6 from Reshevsky, after which, because black has not played d6, white does now have the opportunity to play knight takes c6, followed by e5, kicking the f6 knight around, but this actually gives white no advantage after b takes c6, e5, and knight to g8, leaving white's e-pawn under attack. Let's say you defend with f4. Now black has knight to h6, looking to hop into that nice f5 square, which you can prevent with g4, but that kind of weakens the king side, where it might not be so ideal to castle anymore. Of course, the queen side is looking a bit iffy too, with rook to b8 now on the cards. So this line offers white just a whole lot of nothing, which is why in the game, Fischer goes for bishop to c4. He does love this diagonal. Play continues with a castling from Reshevsky, which threatens knight takes e4, followed by a fork with d5. It's a common opening trick. Black gets his piece back with a better position, and this of course wouldn't have worked before black castled, since if his king was still on e8, there'd be bishop to b5, pinning the knight, threatening to capture there, which is a winning counterattack. So here Fischer plays bishop to b3, eliminating the possibility of that little tactical trick, at which point black has a variety of playable options, including d6, a5, even d5, but Reshevsky, believing that he now has an opportunity to grab a knight for bishop trade, plays knight to a5, targeting the bishop on b3 and setting the stage for what has become known as the Bobby Fischer trap. So pause the video if you've never seen this game and you want to try to find move number 1 of the winning combination now executed by the young Fischer. Here it comes. Bobby Fischer's move is e5, attacking the knight on f6. And at the time of this game, this position was not new. There was actually a Grandmaster game played in the Russian Championship earlier the same year in which black continued knight takes b3 and went on to lose. Reshevsky avoided this line, seeing that after e takes f6, knight takes a1, f takes g7, and king takes g7, the black knight on a1 is not escaping, which means that white has a winning position. So Reshevsky's move, after this e5 from Fischer, is knight to e8, which is actually much worse than taking on b3. Of course, e8 was the only safe square for that knight, since on h5 it would be getting trapped with the move g4. But now Bobby uncorks one of the most spectacular moves he's ever played. Again, if you want to pause the video and try to spot it, go ahead. But here it is. Bobby Fischer now uncorks bishop takes f7 check. And if anyone knows of any games prior to this one that reached this exact position, please let me know in the comments. I searched a couple of databases, couldn't find any examples, but I wouldn't be surprised if Fischer had prepared this trap prior to this game after looking at the game played by those two Russian grandmasters. He was known to be very well versed in all the latest opening discoveries, especially those coming out of the Soviet Union. So let's take a look at black's options here. He's only got 3, but all of them fail in pretty much the same way. If king to h8, then knight to e6 wins the black queen. Anywhere the queen moves, she's going to get captured by a minor piece. And of course, if d takes e6, then there's queen takes d8, so that fails. So what about rook takes f7? That doesn't help. Again, knight to e6 wins the queen in exactly the same way. She's got nowhere to go. The d-pawn's pinned. So the move played in the game by Reshevsky is king takes f7. And again, white's winning move, now played by Fischer, is knight to e6. But in this case, black has an extra option. He could play king takes e6. But this would not be a good idea as it runs into a forced mate in 5 moves, which I have no doubt that Fischer had completely worked out, and which goes as follows. Queen to d5 check, king to f5, it's the only move. g4 check, king takes g4, again, only move. Rook to g1 check, king to h4, queen to e4 check, rook to f4, queen takes f4 check, king to h5, and queen to g4 check mate. So Reshevsky, also realizing that this line leads to mate, had no choice but to give up his queen with d takes e6. And so after queen takes d8 from Fischer, the game is effectively over. After only 12 moves played by white and 11 by black, but ridiculously, Reshevsky decides to play on for no less than another 30 moves. His rivalry with Fischer was very well known, and I guess he just didn't want there to be any headlines saying Fischer beats Reshevsky in 12 moves, even though that's basically what happened. So I'm not going to even go through the rest of the game, since at no point does Reshevsky even come close to overcoming his material deficit, having only a knight and a bishop for Fischer's queen. So I hope you enjoyed these epic performances by Bobby Fischer, utterly annihilating some of the strongest players of his time with some amazing opening traps, and hopefully you'll get a chance to use one or more of these opening traps in your own games. So thank you for watching to the end of the video. That always helps the channel, and so does your liking and subscribing if you found value here, and I will see you very soon.